Hey there, folks. Welcome to Plan to Protect with Melodie Bissell, the safest podcast on the internet. My name is Joshua Bissell, and I'm the editor of this weekly podcast where we tackle topics around abuse prevention and vulnerable sector protection. This month, we're looking at gaps in policies and procedures that we find on a regular basis. And today's subject is about policies that set parameters on activities for your programming. Thank you so much for joining us for Plan to Protect with Melodie Bissell, the safest podcast on the internet. We hope you have a wonderful day. Now, here's Melodie.
Hi Josh, yes, it has been a great week. Thanks everyone for joining us again. As you know, we are working our way through identifying what are common gaps that we find when we do policy review and audits. And today we are going to tackle another gap. And often I find that some of our clients haven't really thought this through and they haven't had really good discussions around it. But it is a requirement of insurance companies to qualify for abuse coverage, and it is a common gap that we have found when we review policies. So I want to encourage you once again, when we're finished this podcast, to go take a look at your policies, your procedures, and identify this week. What you're going to identify is what parameters have you put in place for your volunteers and staff. So I want to tell you about an organization that we worked with probably about 8 years ago. I was asked to come on site for 3 days to help the staff get their heads around abuse prevention and safeguarding and work with their team because there had been some pushback. And the primary pushback was from the youth programming department. And I can remember, even today, I can remember first meeting the director of youth programming at this organization. It was a multi-million-dollar organization that I was working with. They had many, many volunteers, so it was very much a volunteer-based organization. They were working with close to 60 young people on a regular basis. And the director of the youth programming, he was fine if they brought in safeguarding for the children initiatives, but he did not want safeguarding in place for the youth programming. I met him at a restaurant, and I can remember watching him walk into the door of the restaurant, walking towards me, and the body language clearly communicated that he was not on board. He was not looking forward to meeting with me. I think that he was told that he had to meet with me. And I spent the next 3 days with this team of about 7-8 staff members talking about their safeguarding initiatives. In his mind, he felt that so long as he screened and trained his volunteers, the world was their playground. In his mind, nothing was off limits so long as he had done his preliminary work of screening and training, which we've talked about in the weeks prior to today. In his mind, he wanted his volunteers that he had selected to be able to do life on life with those young people. And he didn't like the idea of having policies and procedures in place and having parameters put in place to work with the young people. It was a really hard go trying to get him on board. And he really struggled with it. And he had a really bad attitude about it. And finally, his senior staff director told him, you know what, you go home tonight, you think about it, you get your head around this. I don't care if you have to stay up all night long, but if you want your job, you have to get on board with this. The next day, he came in to the staff meeting, and his body language was completely different. He had been up most of the night. I think he was really wrestling with this. And he finally said to me, he sat down next to me, actually chose this time to come and sit down right next to me. And he said, Melodie, I get it. I absolutely get it. You don't have to convince me anymore. I spent the night wrestling with this and thinking about it. And I understand for us, one of our values here is integrity and excellence. And I understand that we want to role model integrity to our kids. And I want our young people to know that all the adults in their life should treat them the same way as our volunteers do. And I also want their siblings, young people's siblings, their younger sisters and brothers, to know that what they see role modeled by our volunteers and our team within the youth program, that this is what they should expect from all adults in their life. He has become a great champion of Plan to Protect, and he realized that the world was not going to be as wide as he had initially anticipated. And if it was going to be wide, if they were going to do life on life with kids, he was going to have to put some extra safeguards in place to make sure that happens. So today in our podcast, I want to talk about some of those parameters that you should put in place with your volunteers. This should be clearly communicated in your policies and your procedures. So I want to give you a couple other case studies. One was a mother who called me up. She was on staff with an organization, and she called me up and she said to me, Melodie, I feel like I caught my 13-year-old daughter in bed with her youth pastor. And she was calling me from a church. She knew the policies and procedures that they had put in place. And when I asked her what she meant by that, I was a little bit horrified by what she had said. And she said the night before, she had gone into her daughter's bedroom, who was 13 years of age. It was midnight, and her daughter was on her computer in bed. And it was almost midnight, and the daughter was FaceTiming with the youth pastor when she told her daughter, shut the light off, shut your computer off, and go to bed. Her daughter said, I'm just planning Friday night's youth event with the youth pastor. She said her daughter was barely dressed, had baby doll pajamas on. Clearly, her pajamas were clearly seen on the camera, and they were FaceTiming on the camera, and it was midnight. She said, I literally felt like I caught my daughter in bed with the youth pastor. She said, at what point did he not think that was appropriate? Got a phone call from a father one day, and he said to me, can you please tell me the type of social media policies that you have available within your organization? He was on the board of a not-for-profit, and his son was engaged in the program. And he said he found that one of the volunteers within the organization had texted over 750 times in the course of 1 month with his son. And those text messages came in at all hours of the day and night, during school, during class, and it was week of exams. Most of those were initiated by the volunteer. So those are just some of the case studies that we hear about. So I want you to think about how big is the sandbox, how big of the playground, how much freedom you want to give your volunteers and staff, not only in program, but outside of program. When I first started working in youth programming, I was in my late teens. No one at that time had to tell me that I couldn't be communicating 24/7 with the young people in my program. I only saw them once a week. Sometimes I saw them twice a week, but they didn't all have telephones. They weren't on social media. I didn't have a vehicle that I could drive and go see them. My playground, my sandbox was very, very narrow. Today in 2021, Volunteers and staff members that are put in place in a position of trust with children, youth, and vulnerable adults have so much opportunity to engage with the individuals that they work with, either through social media, online engagement, smartphones with cameras, emails, text messaging, seeing individuals outside of program hours, off-site activities. I really encourage you to think about what parameters you are going to ask your volunteers and staff members to comply to. And then make sure in your policies and procedures you clearly communicate what those prohibited activities are and what the parameters are for engagement. I'm just going to give you a few of them for you to think about, and think about, do you have policies and procedures and parameters in place in regards to these areas? One of those is, what about gift giving? Do you have established policies and procedures in place for gift giving? When you're working with children, youth, or vulnerable adults, it's very common for you to have a favorite, for deep relationships to be formed. But by establishing policies and procedures around gift giving will both discourage favoritism and will discourage opportunities for grooming behaviors to take place. Do you have policies and procedures as to when a gift can be given, the amount of that gift, how they can show favoritism or not show favoritism to some of the students? It's really a good idea to have some form of policy in place that says that gifts can be given for birthdays or Christmases, but the gift must be approved by leadership and must not exceed a certain dollar amount. And ideally, that gift that is given to students should be given to all the students, not just a select one or two. That will discourage gifts being given as a means of grooming students. Another parameter that I think is really important for us to put in place, and that is that there can be no dating relationships. We did a policy review for one client, and not only did they have a no dating policy in place, meaning no intimate relationships can be formed, no dating of students that you work with or volunteer with, but that if any relationships were formed, they must be immediately disclosed to human resources or to leadership. And one organization that we did a policy and procedure for, it clearly stated that no dating relationships could be formed within 3 years of you stepping down from that role as a staff member or volunteer. When we conducted a policy review and audit for a very large international organization, we were really pleased to see one of the parameters that they put in place for the youth trips internationally was that the risk assessment had to be done prior to the trip, and that a very complete schedule had to be put in place that was approved by the risk department. So a schedule outlining what every day's activities would look like, and that if anything happened to change the schedule could not be changed and altered without submitting a recommendation and a request to the risk department back home at the home office. This would certainly have addressed an issue that came up, a case that we often talk about here at Plan to Protect, at a summer day camp, when all of a sudden one of the service providers didn't show up. And at the day camp, the kids all of a sudden and the staff had to come up with an alternative plan. So the students of the campers actually said, let's play truth and dare. And it was the student campers that ended up convincing leadership to play truth and dare. So without senior leadership approval, the camp staff played truth and dare with the students. And some of the dares were very disgusting. Licking inside a porta potty, running around the camp without clothes on, licking Kool-Aid out of the counselor's belly buttons. That was not part of the plan for the day camp. So having parameters in place, saying that schedules must be pre-approved and any changes in the schedule must be approved by the risk department, senior leadership, or board, is a parameter that will protect the organization. In the case study I just told you about, this day camp, they ended up facing great scrutiny through the media and legal liability issues. When we write policies and procedures on behalf of our clients, we always include a section on high-risk activities. In this section of the Policy and Procedure Handbook, we identify what are some of the extra measures that will be taken for off-site trips, transportation, retreats, staying in hotel and motel, doing programs in people's homes, billeting. Those are just some of the examples of the high-risk activities that we include in policies and procedures, but we always start that section by what are the prohibited activities that individuals cannot participate in. I think of a fatal accident that occurred at a camp in Northern Ontario. It was the last day of camp, and one of the volunteer staff members wanted to take the ATV out for one last drive before she boarded the bus. Sure enough, she was allowed to take the ATV out on her own. The ATV flipped over and she was killed instantly. The parents could have easily said, no one ever told us that our 16-year-old would be driving an ATV. We understood that she was going to be a camp counselor. No one ever asked us permission if our daughter, who was 16 years of age, could take out an ATV, and certainly an ATV unsupervised. Putting parameters in place, saying that your volunteers and staff cannot engage participants in activities of free falls, whitewater rafting, bungee jumping, rock climbing, driving all-terrain vehicles or any motorized vehicles. Those are parameters that we strongly recommend that you include in your policies and procedures, unless you have certified instructors overseeing those activities, and you share that information and the inherent risks with parents and with the participants, and have them sign off an informed letter of consent. However, we think that there are some activities that should be off limits. Then there are other activities that you will want to narrow the sandbox. That might be transportation, going on off-site activities. So for a school that goes on field trips, their parameters may be that the group must always stay together, or that there always be 2 screened leaders assigned to every group of students. Another way of narrowing the playground or sandbox would be to adjust your ratios for those high-risk activities. So I want to finish off this podcast today by talking about social media and photography. This is a parameter that I certainly believe that every organization, if they want to safeguard students, should clearly consider. I'm not saying don't engage in photography and don't engage in social media, but what parameters are you going to be putting in place? For example, in our policies and procedures, we would recommend that you have a curfew, that you put a time frame saying that you can communicate with students that are over the age of 13 on social media between the hours of 8 a.m. and 10 a.m., but not during school hours. That limits the playground, the sandbox, and it honors the parents. It honors the organization. It shows respect and integrity and reduces the risk of liability. Another parameter that we would recommend that you put in place is that cell phones, cameras should not be allowed in change rooms, washrooms, and where people sleep. That photographs cannot be put on the internet, and that photographs should not be tagged. Those are just some of the examples of parameters that your organization should think through to reduce the liability, reduce the risk of injury, harm, and abuse. At Plan to Protect, we are here to help you with policies and procedures. We have a strong policy department at Plan to Protect. Individuals with expertise who can review your policies and procedures, identify areas where some of your policies should include additional steps of reducing the risk of injury, harm, and abuse, and very clearly defined parameters in place for your staff and volunteers. You don't have to do this alone. We are here to help you. Thank you for logging in again today and listening to our podcast. We hope this series of identified gaps are helpful to you. We have a few more, so listen in next week. Have a great week, everyone. Goodbye.